Okay, so for this part we're just going to add the button into the code. So we have it already in the layout and already set up. We kind of adjusted a few of the properties in the attributes inspector and the size inspector. Now we're going to add it to the code so that we can actually write functions that will change stuff once the app runs. So we're going to just drag and drop it from the layout, so from the main.storyboard into the viewcontroller.swift. And we're going to add two instances of it this time. One's going to be an outlet and one's going to be an action. So the outlet just allows us to change properties of the button, whereas the action handles the button press. Okay, so this is going to be something that's unique to objects or views that have some kind of an event handler. So we saw with the labels we didn't need to do something like this because all it's doing is changing the properties in the code itself. Okay, so now we've added a button to our layout and we've adjusted a few of the properties such as the font and the size and also the text size as well. Let's talk about how to add it into the code itself. And this is an important step because without adding it into the code we're not going to be able to handle any kind of an event such as a click. Because right now with no event handler, once it's clicked nothing happens at all. So it might as well just be a label. So the way we're going to do that, and this is the reason I have kind of the view set up as it is, just so you know, in case you're not sure how to get back to this view, just click this kind of these overlapping circles here. It looks like a Venn diagram. And this is going to be called the assistant editor. This just allows the the main.storyboard and the viewcontroller.swift to be open side by side at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to right click on the button. And you see we get this this blue line come through. What we're going to do is we're going to add this, and you see there the text says insert outlet action or outlet collection. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add it as an outlet. So I'm just going to put it right here, right underneath class viewController UI viewController and above the viewDidLoad function. So once I release it, it gives me this prompt here. So the first thing to note is that under connection there's three different options. We're only going to be interested really in outlet and action. So the one that we're going to choose this time is going to be the outlet. And this is going to be a viewController object. We can give it a name in just a second here. The type is going to be a UI button, and we're going to do weak versus strong storage. So while we're on this topic of outlets and actions, remember when I talked about in the previous video about how we have to create two different instances in the code itself. So one is going to handle the properties and one is going to handle the event handler. So when the button's pressed, something's going to happen. Well, the outlet is what we use to adjust the properties, and the action is going to be what we use to adjust the handler, or rather handle the action, handle the button press. So this one I'm just going to select to be outlet, and let's just call this btn button, and if we want to be specific we can call this outlet. Okay, so the reason I use this kind of naming scheme is because I use BTN, so the three-letter abbreviation, just to kind of remind me exactly what it is. And I know this is called button, so technically I don't really need it because I'm not going to name a label button. But it's a good idea to have this if we have like a bunch of different things, because that way we can just call on the name and right away we know that, oh, well, it's BTN, so it must be a button. It will become a little less obvious when our name is not button, so if we have something like a button that displays text, it might be called btn display text because that's what it's doing. Okay, and I added outlet onto the end of it because it's an outlet, not an action. So I'm just going to click connect here, and it will add in this object right here. Okay, so let's take a look at what's going on with this object that's added. Now when we add in elements from the layout, so when we add in these views or these objects, they start off as optional variables. And this is why we have to add the exclamation mark at the end, because that kind of unwraps it and makes it no longer an optional variable. So we've now created this variable called btn button outlet. It's of type UI button, it's been unwrapped, and it's a weak variable. So now we can call on the btn button outlet and adjust properties if we like. For example, I'm just going to put something quick in the view did load. If we say btn button outlet, there we go. See, it pops up from our list of variables now. So if we do that, then we can kind of call a bunch of functions. If we do dot something, then we'll have a list of different functions pop up and stuff that we can adjust about it. So yeah, so this is one of the first things we need to do if we are adding anything to the layout. We want to immediately set it up in the code as well. I'm just going to delete that because I no longer need it. Okay, so now we've added the object, or the kind of, what do you call it, the outlet. So now we need to add the action. This is going to be kind of like a function of its own. So I'm just going to put it beneath the did receive memory warning function. Okay, so I'm going to create a space for it there. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to right click and drag and drop. Just going to put it here, and this time instead of an outlet we're going to choose action. Okay, and notice another field popped up, and this is going to be the touch up inside event. So there are a bunch of different events, and these handle different kinds of press. So for example, there's a touch down, there's a touch drag, there's a touch cancel, there's lots of different things here. The one that we'll be using most is going to be the touch up inside. So this is just a simple touch. Once a button is pressed or touched, then something happens. Okay, this is going to be type any object. This is going to be UI button. The name, we'll give this a name such as btn button action. So it might be a good idea to kind of keep a very similar name in the action that we saw in the outlet. Just be sure to differentiate between the two, and that's what I'm doing with the action versus the outlet here. Okay, arguments, we want sender, and we could choose sender and event, but we're just going to choose sender right now. And it's an action, so we have everything set up. We're just going to click connect. So this is the setup that we're going to use. And as we see here, it adds this function in, this function called btn button action, and it has a sender that's a UI button. So the difference between this part and this part up here is that this is just creating a variable which we can use to adjust properties. So if we were to then call btn button outlet dot something, we could adjust the properties of the button. So we can adjust stuff like the title, we can adjust stuff like the font, the colors, and all of that good stuff. Whereas this function, the btn button action, is what's actually going to handle the press. So once a button is pressed, then we'll have something happen, and we're going to handle all of that code in this function here. Okay, so this just creates an object so we can adjust the properties. This just creates a function so that we can handle button presses. Okay, so this is how you set your button up in the code. With labels, we saw we only needed one step, and that was just to add the name. That's because labels don't have any kind of an event handler. For these other items, such as the slider or the switch, these are items that have event handlers, so they will have some kind of an event happen once they're pressed or adjusted. For example, a slider, if we slide it back and forth, then there's going to be some kind of an event. A switch, if we switch it on or off, again, another kind of an event. And same with the button, once it's pressed, there's an event. But with labels, they just display text, so we only needed the object. Okay? So that's why we have two different things added instead of one. Just be sure that when you add in your button from your layout to the code, you add in both parts. So one's the outlet, one's the action. Okay, and to do that, I just right-clicked on the button until we see this blue line and just dropped it in. And that allowed us to choose whether we have an outlet or an action. Okay, so that's how to set it up in the code. This next part will deal with kind of some cool attributes and stuff that we can change about the button itself directly in the code rather than going to the attributes inspector. Right, in this part we added the button into the code itself. So we'd already done it in the layout. Now we just simply dragged and dropped it from the layout into the view controller.swift. So the first thing we did was we added the outlet so that we could modify the properties of the button within the code. So by adding this outlet, it kind of creates a new variable which we named btn button outlet, and then we can call this btn button outlet dot something, and then it will give us kind of a list of functions and properties that we can change. Okay, so this isn't actually handling the button press, this is just a change of properties, so stuff like text, color, stuff like that. We next added the actions that we can actually handle the button presses within the code. So this we named btn button action, and this was a function, it was no longer just a variable. So within this function we can write the code, we didn't in this part but we will later. We can write the code that will handle a button press, so it will basically have the name of our button and then a touch up inside, and then once that happens then it will trigger some kind of an event, or it will send some kind of an event which will basically make something happen. Okay, so we're going to see some cool stuff coming right up. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to modify some of the properties, and then we'll deal with this button handler.